Thank you very much, Craig, and thank you for the introduction and for including me in the inaugural year of this new public professor series. It's a great honor to be in the mix for that. I also want to extend thanks to my colleague Jim Linville in Religious Studies. He and Dan Johnson in Geography did the public professor series in the newspaper for several years, something that I hope resurfaces, and I certainly hope that this lecture series continues as well. You'll notice it was Dean Cooper who capitalized the PUB, who put the pub style in public series, and I point that out because parts of this Buddha's World Tour might look a little more like a pub crawl, but I pass that off to him. So this idea of a Buddha's World Tour, of looking at Buddhism and its global spread. Some of this connects to that project that I'm part of right now. Some of it does go all the way back more than 20 years ago when I started in on aspects of this topic. So I'll just set in after introducing the Buddha in the image there. I took that picture last summer doing some field work, and that Buddha is already a global Buddha. That was taken at this monastery. It's a Bhutanese-style monastery, but a Tibetan Buddhist temple in the Bhutanese style. And you might be able to see just off to the left, peeking around there, is a French chateau. This is in the countryside of Burgundy in France. And in the 1970s, Kalar Rinpoche came from Tibet as part of the exile Tibetan community around the same time as the Dalai Lama and others when they were forced to leave Tibet. And they began to spread Buddhism beyond Asia. And he came to the rural French countryside. He even brought practices like the 3-month-long retreat to people who had not grown up in the Buddhist tradition. So it's not just a metaphor that the religious landscape has been transformed by traditions like Buddhism coming over. The actual landscape is quite transformed as well. Now, when introducing the Buddha who is part of this global tour, we have a couple of candidates, a couple of contestants, in a sense. These two guys. Do you notice any subtle differences between them? Both, I would say you are equally likely to encounter one image as the other, as Buddhism has spread beyond Asia. Both can even be called Buddha in a certain sense. The one I'm focused on is the one on the left, known as the historical Buddha, the Buddha from the foundations of the tradition about 2,500 years ago in India. But the one on the right is an interesting character too. You see him quite a bit in East Asia, and again in pop culture here in the West as well. Although many of the films that came out in the 1990s that were quite popular, like Little Buddha in 1993 from Bertolucci, that was based on the historical Buddha in India. Kundun, 7 Years in Tibet, those films from around 1997 were focused on the figure of Dalai Lama. But in other aspects of pop culture, The Simpsons among them, you're likely to see this fellow. And this is someone based on a Chan or Zen monk from China more than 1,000 years ago. I have a 3,000 level seminar going on right now on Zen Buddhism. So we get introduced to him a bit. We have a historical figure from more than 1,000 years ago, but there's also the idea that this is a way that Maitreya Buddha has shown up in our own world. Maitreya Buddha, the future Buddha. So already there's this sense that the Buddha isn't the only Buddha. There's Buddhas of the past, there's the historical Buddha, there's this future Buddha. So these get conflated and confused and mixed up in different ways in the West, but there are a number of figures, and again, we're likely to see one as much as the other. So if that is a depiction of a way that the future Buddha has already shown up in the form of a Zen monk, here are some images of the historical Buddha. Again, a figure a number of you will have come across in different ways. Siddhartha Gautama is the given name of this figure, and these are images from the miraculous stories around the Buddha's birth, the Buddha's training as a young prince as his father worked to groom him to become the next king, and then the transitional period in Siddhartha's life where he goes from that princely upbringing and encounters the types of things that set him on the religious path. In this case, issues of suffering like old age and disease and death, as well as encountering a religious figure and deciding to take a different path, to leave family life behind, cut off his hair, shed his social status, and go through about a 6-year period of hardcore renunciation of religious practices in the woods. That's where you get that image I showed in the beginning where he's so thin, so emaciated, before meditating under what comes to be called the Bodhi tree and becoming a Buddha. Now this other name can come into play. Buddha isn't actually the name of a specific person, it's a title. It's a recognition of an attainment, one who has woken up. Among the different Buddhas of the past and future and different Buddha realms, he is known as Shakyamuni Buddha, the sage of the Shakya clan. The life story includes his death, and this is also seen as important when this tradition starts to become very popular, not only in Asia, but as it moves beyond Asia. In the late 1800s, there was a lot of focus on the life story of the Buddha and the humanness of it, the sense that this is a rational human character, and the story was often retold in the West with a lot of elements stripped away that might indicate too much of the miraculous. Because part of the celebration of Buddhism as it spread beyond Asia was a sense of the kind of rational and scientific. So that's one of the themes that I want to return to when I look at that late 1800s material and connect it to the way that Buddhism is being promoted and spread and presented in our own time. Many of the key Buddhist pilgrimage sites, even today, are sites in India. You can see a little map of India in the lower left-hand corner, the Asian subcontinent, and then the square showing the part that's blown up. The area of northeast India where he was born, that's that first site. Then down to Bodh Gaya, the place of his enlightenment. Over to Sarnath, where he starts the teachings, and then the place of his death in Kushinagara. So even today, these are key pilgrimage sites where Buddhists from different parts of the world will go to revisit these places and remember the life story that way. This is another key symbol that you see a lot in Buddhism, the Dharma Chakra, or the wheel of the teachings. The idea is that the Buddha wakes up to these certain realities about the human condition and how everything is closely interrelated to everything else, causes and conditions that lead from one life to the next. And he wakes up to that reality and then decides to stick around and to teach the Buddhist teachings for the last 45 years of his 80-year-old life. So this wheel is representative of the teachings, but also of their spread. A spread through Northeast India, then to Southeast Asia, to Sri Lanka, to East Asia, Korea, Japan after China, and into Central Asia. Now, of course, over the last 150 years, that wheel has been turning through the West as well, as it's become very much a global tradition. So for tracking the global tradition, looking at how it sort of modernized, represented itself for a global audience, and then spread, that's part of that larger project. So we have a little globalbuddha.org website, and I just wanted to bring this up so you can see my colleagues, Victor Horry from McGill and Alec Susi at St. Mary's University. We've been working on these kinds of projects for a long time, and they're excellent colleagues. The website also shows that funding source that we're very appreciative of SHIRK. So with that little bit of background in mind, rather than going back to the late 1800s right away, I want to start here and now in Lethbridge. The way that this Buddha and Buddha image is just ubiquitous, just pervasive. We see it everywhere. Last fall, we were just walking around Lethbridge shopping. So this isn't even connected to going to, say, the Buddhist temple of southern Alberta. Reverend Izumi is here, and there's this rich Buddhist heritage right here in southern Alberta. That's something I've talked about before and would be happy to address more in the question period if people are interested. But for right now, I'm looking at just how prevalent this image is. Now here, this isn't surprising. This was like a Pier 1 or a store like that where you're importing things from all around the world. What I found more surprising is when we drifted into Winners. This is a store of discount clothes and luggage and kitchenware. I think I was looking for a water dish for our dog. I wasn't on a Buddhist quest or even really a research trip, but there's shelves and shelves of Buddhas. There's this Buddha we just met. There's both types. Again, the image is everywhere. It's operating at different levels. It's not always a part of a practice community, but it's everywhere. This leads us to the pubs. The Buddha image has spread worldwide and in locations that, again, might be a bit surprising. When we were living in Philadelphia, there was a large restaurant opening in the late 90s, a Buddhacon, with this huge Buddha statue right in the middle of the restaurant. The atrium of the Aria Casino in Vegas. Again, you don't necessarily associate the Buddha with attachment to gambling or great riches, but there is that connection between this figure and good luck. The image I'd showed of him before, you might have noticed a little part kind of worn on the belly where he'd been rubbed for good luck. But for the true pub crawl, you have to take a look at the Buddha bar. This is a map showing all of these locations, a lot of locations throughout Europe, different parts of Asia, North America, the Middle East. And these are bars. They started in Paris in the mid-90s. In fact, there's probably an important research trip involved in tracking these down, but I haven't done that yet. But they're everywhere now. They're in Moscow. They're in Kiev, in St. Petersburg. Of course, a Buddha in Budapest, where you would expect to see a Buddha. Massive statue in this bar kind of setting. And I would suggest that when you look at some of these places, like Prague and Monte Carlo, for example, these are European capitals that are also associated with a certain cool. And these are places to be. They're not places that have historically been Buddhist strongholds, but this is part of the image showing up everywhere. This is part of, in a sense, this global world tour and the prevalence of the image. Another place for just looking at the world right now for the sheer prevalence of the spread of this tradition, if you do a search on Amazon, this is from a few days ago, put in Buddha, more than 135,000 items come up, right? Now, all kinds of categories. You may not be able to see the categories along the left, but I listed some of them from books that you would expect, but there's also bracelets, jewelry, video games, these covers for the Wii system, including the intentional bliss decal on the controller. And Buddhism does have a strong focus on intentionality, but it's a strange appropriation of the tradition. I think even more strange are some of these. One of the key teachings in Buddhism, of course, is non-attachment. Getting past desire, craving, ignorance to waking up to some of these realities. So a lock for non-attachment seems puzzling. The good news is you can see it's on a pretty good sale. It's about half off, and I underlined toward the bottom, it ensures good karma and feng shui. I would pay the full 100 for that, but you can get it now for less than 50. Even our other Buddha friend on a Zippo lighter. So whether, again, this is talking about impermanence, a smoke 'em if you've got 'em, or more of an enlightenment kind of thing, I don't know. But we see this image all over. Now, there's a number of different things we can say about the sheer prevalence of the Buddha image in this way. But I want to turn the attention back to books. The original reason I went to get a listing of just how prevalent this is on Amazon. Under Buddhism, we're talking about more than 35,000 books. So for a tradition that was almost unheard of 150 years ago in the West, now there are tens of thousands of books. Now, some of them are great reads. I'd promote this one, for example. This is part of that collaborative venture with Victor Hori and Alex Susi. But I point to it because one of the other types of prevalence for Buddhism, of course, has to do with actual practicing communities. And you'll see this worldwide now. We were working on Canada in particular. So, for example, early in the book, just to give a sense of the coast-to-coast reach of practicing communities right here in Canada, we have at the Vancouver Zen Center, Zen teacher Shan Godfrey rings a bell and a room full of Western Zen students cross their legs and settle into meditation. The center was founded in 1970, and Shan, who trained at the Mount Baldy Zen Center in Los Angeles, is a full-time abbot guiding a full house of students. In Raymond, Alberta, on July 4th of 2004, hundreds of Japanese Canadians gathered to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the Raymond Buddhist Church. 3 generations of past and present members listened to each other's stories of trials, tribulation, faith, and hope. At the Winnipeg Center of Soka Gakkai International, members gathered to chant Namu Myoho Renge Kyo, the title of the Lotus Sutra. After the chanting, one after another, they give testimony of how the daily practice of chanting transforms their lives. In Mississauga, on the western outskirts of Toronto, at the imposing Fo Guang Shan Buddhist Temple, a nun in red and gold robes, leads a congregation of hundreds of Chinese lay people in prostrations before the Buddha. The temple is one of a worldwide network of Foguang Shan temples, whose master in Taiwan, Xing Yun, teaches a modernized humanistic Buddhism. North of Montreal, at Monastère Tambao in Harrington, Quebec, a Vietnamese monk guides visitors around the Hall of 1,000 Buddhas. Arranged strategically around the several hundred acres of the monastery grounds are statues representing the major events of the life of the Buddha. At Gampo Abbey on Cape Breton Island, Nova Scotia, monastics prepare their students for the Sopa Choling retreat, a retreat that lasts 3 years, during which retreatants withdraw from society and spend each day from 5 a.m. to 9:30 p.m. in Buddhist practice. Canadians are practicing Buddhism from sea to sea. So of course there's that dimension of spread as well. Now, we were exploring Buddhism in Canada in particular, some of those case studies, some of the communities, some of the leaders, some of the statistics, and analyzing change through history as well. The follow-up book that was just from 2014 filled in some more of that background and case studies, but also started to ask more questions about how to understand Buddhism in any one location, in Asia or beyond Asia. It's absolutely essential to understand the larger global connections. So you can see the subtitle there, Global and Local Buddhisms in Canada. That's what we pursued through that book, and that's what led to the current project, where we're looking at this, this phenomenon from a global perspective. In those thousands of, tens of thousands of books on Buddhism, many of them are written by Buddhist practitioners for other Buddhists. Quite a few of them are also academic works. I have another few up here that are excellent studies of the type of spread of global Buddhism today. Again, of course, they're not all in English. The one in the middle is from the excellent sociologist of religion, Raphael Doj, and he's looking at, if you can see the subtitle there, oh, it's too blurry on mine too, in perspective, a sociological perspective on the globalization of religion, and then global Buddhism as the main title. He sees Buddhism as an especially useful case study to see how religion is globalizing worldwide. The one in the upper right by David McMahon on Buddhist Modernism gets to a lot of the characteristics that we see with Buddhism in places like North America and Europe. The way that there's often a focus on the historical Buddha, on meditation, on a kind of rationality or a scientific basis that seems to be less ritualistic, less tied in with things that might be labeled as superstition. So he unpacks some of those characteristics in that history. And then I also included Mindful America by Jeff Wilson. Some of you know Jeff. He's been to the Buddhist Temple of Southern Alberta. He's been out to the University of Lethbridge a couple of times. And most recently, a little over a year ago, he came and gave a talk on Mindful America shortly before this book came out. This is the phenomenon that you're probably most likely to encounter today. This is spreading very rapidly, and you see it in kindergarten classes to kind of settle kids. You see it deployed by the military, including veterans after they're back, as a way to work through post-traumatic stress disorder. There's a strong emphasis on the kind of therapeutic use of Buddhism that comes through this mindfulness movement. And Jeff argues that, like with the spread of Buddhism to other countries at other times, the host culture is appropriating things important to it, things that it values. So for example, in America, which is the focus of the mindfulness movement in his study, there's a large industry for dieting and a lot of books on mindful eating, using it therapeutically in those ways too. But if you look at the titles for this mindfulness movement, again, it's kind of surprising in contrast to the life of a celibate Buddhist monk back in the day. You have books on mindful parenting, mindful sex. In theory, not two subjects that celibate Buddhist monks should be expert on. But that's very much part of the movement. This scientific sense, the rationality, the therapeutic or medicinal kind of use of Buddhism, that's part of what I want to focus on here, to pick one element of Buddhist modernism, one element of this global spread of Buddhism, where we can see some clear connections between what's happening worldwide for Buddhism today and what was happening when it started to roll out beyond Asia in the late 1800s. So if we further refine the search in Amazon, to Buddhism and science, we're still looking at almost 3,000 books. Some of them, like that top one by Lopez, are excellent studies about ways this connection has been made, even though the forefront of science has changed rapidly during that time, even though what has been meant by Buddhism has changed rapidly by that time. So even though these are both moving targets, there's been a constant in the culture of representing Buddhism, especially in the West, but also in Asia, as somehow in alignment with science. Many of the books are more like these ones, though. There's a list of authors at the left, and you can see where I've done the red underline for these. Mathieu Ricard comes up a lot, particularly in France, but also in the West. All three of these books are looking at some kind of convergence between Buddhism and science. The middle one by Alan Wallace, someone who did his undergraduate in physics and then graduate work in religious studies. Mathieu Ricard did a doctorate in science as well. He was looking at an aspect of genetics under a Nobel laureate in France, but after his doctorate he switched over to being a Buddhist monk studying under the Dalai Lama. In fact, the bottom one is by the Dalai Lama. The most recognizable figure in Buddhism worldwide is also writing about this convergence between Buddhism and science. I'm not arguing that they're closely related, but I'm finding it very interesting that they've been paired in this way, and that this pairing between Buddhism and science goes way back to the late 1800s, to the things I was studying more than 20 years ago as an undergraduate. So we have this pairing. We have this idea of Buddhism as being more scientific and rational, and this is an idea that's gained quite a bit of traction. One way that you can see that this link between the two has been pretty persuasive is to look even at literature, best-selling books put out by the neo-atheists, who are very critical of religion as a whole, often give Buddhism a pass. So, for example, so many of you know works by Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and in the case of Sam Harris, he has a section on that early bestseller that came out in 2004, a section on the wisdom of the East, where he clarifies that he finds Eastern spirituality strikingly different from and superior to the limitations and dangers of Christian, Jewish, and Muslim faith. To illustrate this difference, he cites a passage on the nature of consciousness by the 8th century Buddhist tantric master Padmasambhava. His praise of this passage, which he says he selected at random with his eyes closed, which is an interesting mystical twist on the rational, is as extreme as his earlier critiques of religion. So Harris argues that one could live an eon as a Christian, a Muslim, or a Jew and never encounter any teachings like this about the nature of consciousness. Moreover, he deems these Buddhist expressions of consciousness to be precise, phenomenological studies unmatched even by scientific, Western contemporary literature on consciousness, which spans philosophy, cognitive science, psychology, and neuroscience. And he's studied some of those at a graduate level as he makes these claims. Harris brings insights from the fields into his critique of religion, and he makes further references to Eastern spirituality, which he credits for some of his own ethical sensibilities and perspectives. For these sources, he avoids the word religion, and just before the epilogue he states, mysticism is a rational enterprise, religion is not. Mysticism is credited with direct experience of the world, and religion is deemed to be denial, characterized by dangerous ignorance where bad concepts are held in place of good ones for all time. Super critical of religion, not so much of Buddhism. So I'm saying that something about this pairing of the rational has taken hold, if we're even seeing it show up with some of these key critics in our own time. They don't all follow that suit. Hitchens includes a section, "There is no Eastern solution," to shoot that down. He's going to be critical through and through with religion. But for Harris and Dawkins, they remove certain Asian religious traditions, including Buddhism, from these objectionable categories of religion and treat them more as rational philosophies, practices in empirical awareness, or ethical systems. And I think all of you have probably heard that about Buddhism, an argument that it's not really a religion, it's a philosophy, it's an ethical system. So, my argument is that this position goes back to the late 1800s. That this position was forged, and quite intentionally so, by a number of key figures coming from the West, and even more so by some key reformers coming out of South and East Asia. I'll bring up a couple of names here, but I won't do too much. Lisa was pretty clear there shouldn't be slides with too much text. So there's a couple in here, but we'll move through them pretty quickly. Early on in the West, people had no idea what Buddhism was. Or there were some ideas about Buddhism and Hinduism, but they were all confused and conflated together. People would hear the stories of travelers and missionaries about this religious practice here and there, but they didn't realize they were talking about the same tradition because in each area, different languages were used. A lot of local practices shaped how Buddhism showed up in different parts of the world. But the French scholar, Eugene Burnouf, recognized that there was a Buddhist strain running through all of these descriptions, that Buddhism was a kind of a pan-Asian religion showing up a bit differently in different areas. So from the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, we began to get a sense of the tradition from scholars. In the 19th century, we had a different kind of push for the popularization of Buddhism. Sir Edwin Arnold, for example, wrote The Light of Asia, the book in that upper right. So Queen Victoria and many other Victorians were reading this poetic account of the life story of the Buddha and were enthralled by it. We're finding Buddhism very attractive in that way. You started to get Westerners like the Theosophists, Madame Blavatsky and Colonel Henry Olcott, actually going to Asia, going first to India and then down to Sri Lanka and converting to Buddhism. Olcott staying there for quite a while to work with different Buddhist reformers in Sri Lanka. There's a fair bit known about those Western figures. What I would argue, and part of what my colleagues and I are arguing in the larger project, is to really understand what's going on, we have to recognize that a lot of the modernizing reforms that we recognize now in the West happened in Asia, originated in Asia, or were centered in Asia in dialogue with some of these Western figures. So I have a few figures up here. Anagarika Dharmapala, he was active in Sri Lanka with the reform movements, and then two monks from Japan, Shakukozen and Shakusoen. Shaku is like Shakyamuni, so that Buddha. You leave the family behind to become a Buddhist monk, but kind of take the family name of Shakyamuni Buddha. So again here, to minimize rambling a little bit, let me just read a short section that kind of shows how these figures connect with each other and with the ones I just had up before them. Meiji Japan and Ceylon, which for ease I will hereafter refer to by its current name, Sri Lanka, at the same period, near the end of the 19th century, were significant sites for the modernization of Buddhism. These regions were important nodes in the global Buddhist network for mutually influential contact between North America and Europe on the one hand, and Asian Buddhist countries on the other. Scholars have analyzed the interplay between local reform and Western influence in each of these countries during this formative era. A welcome development has been greater attention directed to intra-Asian international travel between Japan and Sri Lanka, as well as among other nations in Asia. Examining these encounters within Asia is essential to understanding iterations of modern representations of Buddhism. In his 2004 article, Seeking Shakyamuni, Travel and the Reconstruction of Japanese Buddhism, Richard Jaffe raises several telling examples of Meiji Japanese figures who traveled to Sri Lanka and elsewhere in the late 19th century. These figures simultaneously became aware of the larger Buddhist world in its diversity and applied their findings from abroad to their own domestic reform agendas, particularly in Japan and Sri Lanka in these two sites. The Shingon and Zen monks, Shakukozen and Shakusoen respectively, spent years in Sri Lanka, where each took novice vows in the Theravada tradition. So that's the tradition you see dominant in Sri Lanka and Thailand, Burma, Myanmar, Laos, much of Southeast Asia. And that's not the Buddhism that became popular in China, Korea, and Japan, but they, as part of that global movement, it wasn't just the West becoming aware of Buddhism and vice versa, it was also other parts of the Asian Buddhist world encountering each other, and they sought this experience out. The more senior Shakukozen even continued on to full ordination during his 7-year stint in Sri Lanka. The experiences in Sri Lanka of those two figures are illustrative of the expansion and intensification of global Buddhist networks. The travel of these pioneers precipitated encounters with other prominent Buddhist figures, such as Dharmapala in Sri Lanka. Dharmapala was one of the most active nodes in the network of modern Buddhism from his travels in other parts of Asia and to the West, and his activism in local reform and the reclamation of Bodh Gaya. That's that key pilgrimage site of the birth of the Buddha in India. He reclaims it for Buddhism, as well as his role with Theosophy and as a representative of Buddhism. The linkages work in multiple directions. Not only are the Japanese Buddhists learning about Theravada Buddhism and studying Sanskrit and Pali, they are also exposed to the theosophical inflections of Buddhist reform in Sri Lanka, which is put in dialogue with their own reform movements in Meiji Japan. Domestic pressures and local agendas in both key Asian regions of Buddhist reform prompted outreach among these Buddhists in search for a more global, unified front. In this effort, the rising interest in Buddhism among Westerners was generally seen as a potent support against local challenges, such as Christian missionary work in Sri Lanka, and the persistent push for modernization in Japan that continued to question the relevance of Buddhism, even after the brief persecution of Buddhism in Japan at the beginning of the Meiji era had subsided. The encounter demonstrates several of these connections beyond Asia. Dharmapala is linked to Alcott, the co-founder of the Theosophical Society, and a major force in the local Buddhist reform scene. Dharmapala also critiques aspects of Alcott's representation of Buddhism. Alcott, like a lot of these Westerners, he embraced parts of Buddhism, but there are whole parts he wanted nothing to do with. So, for example, the famous tooth relic in Kandy in Sri Lanka, very important culturally and religiously for the Buddhist community there, he wanted nothing to do with it. That was part of the ritualistic, superstitious aspect of religion, according to him, that he wanted to leave behind, part of the reason he was interested in Buddhism. So there were real tensions among these figures too, but they were helping each other and influencing each other in a lot of different ways. And even the monk Kozen there traveled with Dharmapala to Bodh Gaya and founded the Mahabodhi Society that reclaimed that birthplace of reclaimed that pilgrimage site connected to the Buddha's enlightenment, still the key Buddhist pilgrimage site today. So they're interacting with each other in all kinds of directions, all of these sorts of global forces, but much of it is motivated by some domestic issues. Japan, the Buddhists in Japan do have this concern, this problem about, is the tradition up for the modern period? Is it a drag on modernity that will slow them down and keep them behind, or is it an asset that will help them in some way? So they have their own domestic agendas as well as this expansion to other parts of the globe. So this is where science comes in again. There is a strong sense that science has a certain strength and power and currency in the late 1800s. So to show how this is very much a conversation that was going on in Japan, and not just in the West, let me bring up one example from Kiezawa Manshi. He's a figure I spent a lot of time with, well, not exactly with, but studying in the early 1990s, studying his work from the 1890s and 1880s. And I was translating some things in journals and other articles, and I came across one bit that I thought was a very telling example. Let me just jump to that. Okay, so the Japanese Buddhists seized upon the scientific critiques of Christianity that countrymen had encountered abroad. Western professors at Japanese universities had also brought similar ideas that various modes of modern scholarship, including the turn to scientific empiricism, challenged core doctrines of Christianity. Both sources fed into a domestic discourse influenced by Japanese intellectuals, religious reformers, and increasingly numerous journals and newspapers. These interconnected and cross-cultural critiques informed intriguing polemics between Buddhist and Christian apologists, Buddhist apologetics, kind of defending Buddhism against Christianity and against critics in their own country, emphasized what they saw as a close connection between Buddhism and science. And they advanced the idea that evolution could serve as another tool to undermine Christianity. So they saw this going on in Europe. They saw this going on in North America, that there were a lot of critiques of Christianity based on evolutionary thought, and they also realized that this was something they could maybe capitalize on. So one of the ways it plays out that I found kind of amusing, you have this group of figures, these young Buddhist priests. Some of them are philosophers. Some have traveled abroad and encountered these different ideas. Some, like Kiezawa Manshi, stayed right in Japan. But they get to talking about what they can do to promote Buddhism, to promote Japanese interests, and they come up with a bit of a plan. Kiyosawa decides he'll pursue philosophy, that this will be important for promoting Buddhism on this new global stage. But he indicates to this guy named Inaba that that guy should study zoology to get the evolutionary theory. Both of these choices were understood as means to help promote Buddhism, but it doesn't quite work out for Inaba Shomaru. When he's reminiscing about this decision, it reveals the underlying logic of his determination to embark upon a scientific career path, and it shows what actually happens. So these are in Inaba's words. In order to follow Kiyosawa Manchi's advice, I came to master zoology. At that time, in Kiyosawa Manchi's words, if one was to cast off Christianity, one would have to crush it somehow. The quickest way to crush it is by means of the theory of evolution. To master the theory of evolution was the reason I had to master zoology. He said, you be sure to master that as your thing. I followed this as your thing, kind of a loose translation, I think. I followed this and mastered zoology, but people were not attending lectures on evolutionary theory. We were doing things like dissecting rats. Clearly, the order of things, even up to today, is that I continue to spend my days in a similar, ordinary way without crushing Christianity. So that was, quite disappointing for him. But you can see the level of commitment and the idea that, again, science was going to be very, very useful on that front. Okay, so there's quite a bit of that going on in Japan at the time. Different people are studying these ideas, and they're deploying them domestically in different ways to bring Japan to a modern nation state, which it does incredibly rapidly in the Meiji era, in those last decades of the 1800s. But they're also looking to modernize Buddhism in different ways. And this is part of what we're indicating as our larger argument, that if you just see modern Buddhism as a westernization, something the West has done to Buddhism, you miss part of the point, that a lot of it happened in Asia, and a lot of these figures had their own reasons for presenting Buddhism the way that they did. One of the places where we can see this most clearly is at the huge Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. So this is that tradition of world fairs that starts in London, I think it was in 1850, and a number of major capitals host their own world fair. Each one will have a little bit of a different emphasis. There was more of an emphasis on art and culture in Paris, for example. In Chicago, one aspect of emphasis was a kind of ranking of cultures, and it even involved a ranking of religions in a way that I'll show you in just a moment. So these are images of the city, really, that was built for this huge event in 1893. And again, this was attended by more than 30 million people went to the expo. So, roughly the population of Canada attended this expo. On Chicago Day alone, the attendance exceeded 700,000 people. So the expo was huge, and then people who weren't going were still reading about it in newspapers and magazines. Japan had a very prominent position at this expo. They paid a lot of money for it, and that's because the Japanese government saw it as in their strategic interest to kind of go large or go home. I mean, they put everything into it. They got a prime site for the Hoden, for the Phoenix Hall that they put on the Wooded Isle, this island right in the middle of the lake, right at the center of a lot of the activity. And it worked. People were extremely impressed with Japan. And this also helped set up the presentation of Buddhism by the Japanese representatives at the end of the expo when they had this big World's Parliament of Religions. So this event comes up frequently when people are talking about the spread of Buddhism beyond Asia, because it was such a spectacle. So many people were involved and in attendance, and it was the first time for many to actually see Buddhist representatives talking about their own tradition. Some of the influential representatives were coming out of the British colonial world of India and Sri Lanka. So they had excellent English language skills that they used for their presentations. We have Dharmapala again, one of the representatives for Buddhism, Vivekananda representing Hinduism. We can see in newspaper accounts, I'm afraid that will be probably too small and blurry, but it indicates that Oriental delegates talk eloquently of their faith, given an ovation. Oh, I also have the one Shinto representative on the left, because there's a little tag here. Right Reverend Shibata salutes two Western ladies. That was an interesting scene. He didn't actually say anything. He was just there in costume, and someone else read his talk about Shinto, but the women rushed the stage in rock concert style. People were warning it might collapse, and he kissed two of them. which the writer of the article says is just a typical Japanese custom. If any of you know Japanese customs, public display of affection is not one of them. Anyway, everyone was paying attention to this event, and the Japanese Buddhists who I have pictured there, along with Hirai, who was a layperson, not a monk, so he wasn't part of that group photo, they were very influential. The Zen figure, Shaku Soen, who you see second from the right in the seated group, he was in many ways the most influential of all and drove the message about Buddhism and science home most strongly. Now, they saw their mission here as promoting Buddhism, but also that promoting Buddhism would be a way to promote Japan. That the West, at this point, they saw as, materially and technologically more advanced, but maybe with a sort of spiritual deficit that Buddhism could fill, because they were representing Buddhism as scientific, as rational, as up to the challenge of modern times. The last slide that has a fair bit of text, I'll just summarize. Those two Buddhists I just went through, Ashitsu Jitsuzen and Toki Horyu, they had messages like this one in Buddhist journals before they even came over to Chicago. Messages where here, for example, partway down, you see this idea that religion controls the brain and spirit. Religion influences politics, literature, education, art, skills, customs, and traditions, and is a very important one. Thus, religious victory is an eternal victory. It is the big victory among victories. So it's part of the kind of pep speech before coming over, a sense that presenting religion would be very important, kind of a soft power move, a bit like we get with different aspects of not just Buddhism, but also Japanese pop culture and different things in our own time today, where it isn't always an economic or military kind of influence, but more of a soft power cultural influence. So these figures are presenting the tradition, and they're often doing it in this language of science. So I will end in just a couple of minutes. Let me just take Shaku Soen again, our Zen figure there. He's the one who drives this message home most forcefully. Shaku Soen presented Buddhist positions in two papers for the Parliament. The subject of Soen's first paper, The Law of Cause and Effect as Taught by Buddha, explained a core concept of Buddhism, indicated the essential unity within Buddhism on this teaching, and allied Buddhist cosmology with the laws of nature. Without recourse to the confrontational tone invoked by the layperson Hirai Kinza, who was up earlier, Soen nonetheless contrasted this Buddhist law, which does not rely on supernatural interference, with Western religious notions of creationism, an active divine agent and divinely meted out teleological possibilities. These were among the arguments he was making. Soen stated that Buddhism considers the universe as no beginning, no end, since even if we trace back an eternity, absolute cause cannot be found. So we come to the conclusion that there is no end in the universe. The causal law is in a logical circle, changing from cause to effect, effect to cause. Soen identified this causal law as the source of moral authority, and repeatedly insisted that there is no divine agency at work in the law of cause and effect. Buddha does not make it happen. He's just a man who discovered with clarity how it works. Soen noted that according to the different sects of Buddhism, more or less different views are entertained in regard to the law of causality, but so far they agree in regarding it as the law of nature, independent of the will of Buddha and still more of the will of human beings. So you can see, this message delivered to a huge audience in the early 1890s, an audience in the West, an audience back at home in Japan, had a lot of that link between Buddhism and science that we still see in a lot of the books that are connecting those two today. Even after he left the Parliament, he kept in close contact with some of the main movers and shakers on the Western side of things. The publisher Paul Karras, for example, there's an archive in Southern Illinois, at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, full of all of their correspondences. So when I was looking through these different letters, you would see quite a few like this, where they're writing back and forth to each other, talking about Buddhism and truth and science. In another one, other than the one up at the moment, Shaku Soen says, "As for my part, I'm a Buddhist, but far from being a conservative religionist, my intention is rather to stir a reformation movement in the religious world. In other words, I am one who insists on the genuine and spiritual Buddhism to renovate that formal and degenerate Buddhism. And I believe that if the present Christianity be reformed, it will become the old Buddhism. And if the latter be reformed, it will become the future religion of science. So you have science, in a sense, at the top. You've got the new Buddhism that he's pushing for, which reforms the old Buddhism. Christianity as a way to work up to the level of the old Buddhism. There's this hierarchy, this kind of continuation that the founders of this world's parliament were also promoting. But they were definitely promoting Christianity as the peak. And the Japanese Buddhists were putting Buddhism there, and they were using science to make that argument. And finding many allies in the West who were finding that argument to be compelling. This idea of more rational, less superstitious. So when you look at the books by Paul Karras, like the Gospel of Buddha, when you look at these early figures, we have our Shakusoan and Anagurika Dharmapala, who are at the World's Parliament. We've got Karras, and then we have later figures. Many of you will have heard of D.T. Suzuki, a student of Shakusoan's who comes over to North America and Europe and is the most influential figure of the 20th century for introducing ideas of Zen Buddhism in particular, but to an extent Buddhism and Japanese culture more generally to the West. They're all linked to each other and to this global spread. So that's part of what we're getting at with some of this project, an idea that the pervasiveness of Buddhism today and some of the ways that it's characterized as, again, the more rational and scientific, as just one of the examples of those characterizations, it has a history. And it has a kind of intentionality behind that early exposure to Buddhism where many of the reformers in Asia played a very important role. It's not just a westernization. This one we won't have time to look at, which is just as well, but it will give an idea of possible things that we could talk about in a question period if anyone is interested. When you look at the growth of Buddhism through the 20th century, so I'm just really talking about today, and more than 100 years ago. If you look at all that period in between, there's all kinds of different movements from the Beats in the Bay Area in the 50s and 60s, different Asian teachers in the West teaching to groups here, but also Westerners traveling to Asia, training there, bringing the teachings back. Of course, the role of Asian immigrant communities has been the most influential of all for the actual spread of Buddhism and the practice of Buddhism as a lived tradition in the West as well as in Asia. Convert communities, the way that so much of the emphasis has switched to lay people, but lay people doing the things that monks had traditionally done in Asia, things like seated meditation, for example. Buddhist studies in the university, pop culture in this sense of a sort of a global cool for Buddhism. These are all aspects that need more analysis, and again, the one I've been a bit more focused on, these enduring ties between science and rationality that have focused in on things like psychology, different therapeutic aspects, mindfulness. A humanistic or engaged Buddhism has been very much a part of the conversation of Buddhism worldwide in recent decades. And you get books like this one, The Practical Neuroscience of Buddha's Brain, Happiness, Love, and Wisdom. This sort of mix between self-help and a kind of scientific rational, sort of trying to have both sides of it in that connection. So I think that is probably more than enough. We should probably switch to questions and can discuss any of these things or go in other directions altogether, like Buddhism more locally. Thank you.
Thank you, John. We'll just open it up for discussion. Any questions for John?
Are there any principles